One of my unique abilities, and maybe perhaps the most powerful part of what I do as a consultant, is my ability to do a critical critique. Hi, I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips, and I want to share with you the value of the critical critique, and it builds on Napoleon Hill's accurate thinking. So I'm going to critique my podcast series. I have 54 hours of podcasts available online. I've actually have hundreds of hours of podcasts and videos and presentations available on my websites. And I actually have a number of publications that some of them you may not know about. So my role is a copywriter primarily for my own materials. I do technical writing and research reports for my clients. I also do consulting for my clients and advisory services for clients. The podcasts I have are meant to be a demonstration of value for the general audience and also for my clients. If they ask me a question, because I'm primarily engaged, maybe 85 to 95% of my time is billable work. So I've managed to cultivate my activities like we're trying to do for you as a copywriter, business development consultant, or a marketing agency, is we're trying to get you maximum billable hours. Well, I've created for myself maximum billable hours, so I'm not able to take phone calls. I'm busy. I've got teams to manage. I've got people to work with. I got other people on the staff that can take your calls, but ultimately I use the podcast to reply to the questions that I get from clients. I get very few questions from the actual podcast itself. Never in maybe 10 years has anybody said, I was listening to your podcast and I got a question about such and such. Most of the time it's, hey, I listened to the podcast because you sent me there because I'm a client, and thank you for answering my question. So this podcast touches on the value of your self-critique, because when you critique your clients, it's an opportunity for them to get feedback in a very short and focused way, but it's also a way as a consultant for you to set up the opportunity to do a service or repair. Now, I use a method called gap analysis in order to set up my critiques. So for my podcast, which I just described to you, has very little traffic, even though it has 54 hours of materials. Rarely does anybody binge the materials. Most of the time that people are sent directly to a podcast episode to listen to because they have inquired first. So I generated a lead first. Now this for me is the ideal situation to be in. I generate a lead. The lead asks a question. I send them to an article or a podcast or a special report. Those things build credibility and position me, and then I follow up with the lead in order for them to become a client. I got 4 or 5 private clients. I really don't need 100 private clients because I want to keep the agency small. I want to keep the activities that I do small. I have other activities that I'm doing. There's a limited amount of time. But you might be different. Perhaps you want the podcast or the blog posts or the articles that you write to draw in that lead initially. Well, how do we do it? So I'm critiquing my own site. First off, my podcasts are not consistent in time. They're being triggered by people's questions. They're being triggered by ideas and concepts that we're organizing from assignments. So I got it in an ideal situation for me, but maybe you want to be attracting people. Well, that's a regular show. People tune in for a regular show. Now, when people tune in for a show, they tend to be a little bit more passive. I don't want passive people. I want active people. So again, I use a direct response model where I'll create materials based on their interests and needs, and I'll use it as lead generation, but I'll tend to generate the lead prior to that. And the show is actually generating a specific topical lead. But again, if I wanted more general traffic, I would do a more regular podcast. Also, the audio quality of my podcasts are not consistent. In fact, I've been bringing in archival materials. I've always used an audio recorder to answer questions for clients because I can speak better than I can write at times. And a lot of times I can speak it, have it transcribed, and then have it written to get a better result. So again, the audio quality is not consistent. When you watch the Joe Rogan show, they're in a studio. The interview quality is good with the speakers. Everybody's easy to understand. I'm right now using a better microphone in a Mac computer here to do the recording, so this quality is pretty good. But again, the quality is back and forth. Sometimes there's background noise. Sometimes there's interruptions. To avoid the interruptions and background noise, it would be better if I had a regular environment for the podcast itself. Like right now, I can hear some echo under my desk, and I can hear a little echo off the screens. Around the corner, I actually have a station for my that has a sound baffle. So it blocks a little bit of that echo much better. Now, hopefully the microphone is clean enough that you can understand. But again, if you want to have a more regular audience, which is useful if you're doing promotions all the time, a more regular audience, it is going to be better sound quality. It is going to be more consistent recording schedule. It's going to be a broader audience topic. See, I'm doing podcasts specific for subscriber questions. So I'm really only talking to one person. Now that model of talking with one person is actually a very good model in your copywriting and in your any audio or platform presentations. But again, if you want to reach a broader crowd, that one person needs to be a more general person. So when I say copywriters, business development consultants, and marketing agencies, those are real specific people. They do very specific things. If I was going to do a copywriting podcast, I might include business owners in general. I might include writers in general who want to become copywriters. I might include more of the getting started folks. There are always an unlimited supply of folks getting started, putting their toe in the water to get interested in an idea or topic. If you want a popular podcast or a popular blog, then you need to reach the very general audience. Again, as I've disclosed in the past, the only reason I maintain and run Ad Briefing Copywriting Tips is because my other publications, sometimes people say I need a copywriter. If I'm not available for the copy, I'll look through my subscriber list and I'll find somebody who might be available. Somebody might say to me, hey, Justin, I need pay-per-click marketing. I don't do that. I'll make the referral. And where do I get my referrals from? Where I get them from my list. Also, before I hire copywriters or writers for anything that I do, I like them to be subscribers, and I like for them to have gone through a few of the courses from Patrick Quinn so that they have the basics of what we're doing here. So let's go back to the critique. My website doesn't present every podcast that I've posted. So I've got podcasts on YouTube channel. I've got it on Apple Podcasts. I've got it for the Ad Briefings Copywriting Tips podcast. I think it's on like 5 platforms. I've got Spreaker is my main platform. It's everywhere except my website. If you go to the adbriefings.co.uk website, you're going to discover under the blog and under the podcast category, like all the numbers don't make any sense because there's like podcast 74 and podcast 45. Well, I've only created show notes for some of the podcasts that were of interest to somebody. And I have a bunch of show notes that are in my organization system. But I didn't type them up there because I'm not getting paid to type them up there. The podcast is a free service. So that's why they're not there. But again, if you want a more popular podcast, if you want more traffic to your website, if you want more blog readers, not necessarily more leads, but if you want more blog readers, then you're going to have regular and consistent publishing of the show notes for your podcast so that people can come to your website instead of YouTube, instead of these other channels, and they can see what you have to offer. Now, when you go and you find out about my podcast, you're going to know that it's on the Google channel, it's on the Apple channels, it's everywhere pretty much. If I do the meta information consistently, it would provide feeders. So Apple Podcast, if someone's searching for a podcast on better copywriting and they're a getting started copywriter, they're going to find all kinds of things. But if they're an existing copywriter that already has clients who wants to build up their agency, they want to build up their cash flow and their earnings, they're going to be more likely to come towards my niche podcast than they are towards this general podcast. But again, if you have the general audience, you will have 10 to 15% of that audience that will fit that niche category anyway, and you can actually peel them off into a service or some kind of program. I don't want the general audience in general because I get tired of, I've been doing this for like 20 years, folks. I get tired of some of the really general questions, and somebody on staff can answer those. But if the volume is super high, then I need a full-time person on staff or a part-time person on staff to answer those things. So I just figure it's best to select my audience differently And there's some pros and cons to this, but if I select my audience differently, I get the more complex questions like the one I'm answering today, which is how do we build a podcast that gets the maximum audience? And by demonstrating my ability to critique, I'm actually critiquing my own podcast about the things that I would do in my own podcast if I wanted a larger and more general audience. See, this is very important. My podcast serves its needs, not the needs for a general audience. And its needs are very specific types of professionals in the marketplace, somebody who's already a copywriter, somebody who's already doing business development consulting. And by the way, business development consulting is a unique niche that a lot of folks are afraid to get into, but it's high ticket. It is $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 an assignment, and it is often long-term and builds on the customer base. So when I was doing business development consulting for government contractors, I could be in on one contractor and close a $7 million deal, and it brings on 70 people, and it might be 3 different contractors bringing those people to the table. And every contractor I interacted with who was a sub became a potentially new client, and I was just so busy that I didn't even bother with a website. I didn't bother with anything other than a business card and a telephone, because I could literally call up somebody and they were ready to do business, as long as you could bring money to the table, as long as you were a rainmaker. And then, of course, the marketing agency is the logical next step for any copywriter who starts getting more assignments than they can handle, who is utilizing either copywriters or an assistant to help them with their day-to-day productivity. And so, again, if you want a broad-scale podcast, you're going to look at a market a little bit higher than that. It might be people getting started in copyright. It might be people getting started with business development. I'm giving you my example here. Whatever your niche is, or whatever your customer's niche is what you would focus at. So, for example, if you have a client who sells skis and they want to have a podcast about skis, they're not going to have a podcast about expert skiers who are competing in competitions, because it's real easy to get a list of those people. You can just go look at the last ski competition and send a mailing to everybody who placed. They're going to want to have more serious skiers. Now, if their positioning is the serious skier who wants professional equipment, they're going to go after the top-end market, and then they're going to go after this midsection market. That midsection market might be interviews and partnerships with ski resorts, and also interviews with skiers that do different types of skiing. So cross-country skiing and people who do 20 miles on cross-country. It might be people who go 5 or 10 times a year. That way, you can reach people who might be a little more difficult to find. Yes, you can go to American Express and rent a list of people who spend a certain amount of money at ski resorts. You can go into the catalog markets and find people who spend a certain amount of money on ski equipment, but ultimately they might want to serve this super niche market for credibility, but they need to serve the broader market for cash flow. And so your podcast for a ski equipment company would focus on this middle market, and then periodically have these, what's called a step up. They periodically have this just getting started material to take somebody from they're getting more serious about skiing and get them into the middle. So they go to once a year for a week to ski, and they've been thinking, they love skiing. They like to go twice a year. That little bits of content, maybe 10 to 20% of the content, would be for those folks that want to join. They want to join the crowd of not the crowd, or they want to join the more elite group of the professional or the amateur skier who's considering doing these things. And so now they can play the middle. They can interview professional and pro skiers, maybe the people they sponsor. They can interview ski resorts, and then they can offer hope to the people who want to be there someday and go skiing twice a year. Do you see how this works, folks? Do you see how you can take a podcast or blog posts or articles, and you can narrow niche them to an audience to zero in and get very little traffic, but lots of leads? That's what my podcast does. Lots of qualified leads. The lead flow isn't spectacular, believe me. 54 hours of audio and video, I'd expect it to have more visitors. But again, I'm not doing some of the things that are necessary to get those visitors, because I don't want the flow. I'm really comfortable with what I've got going on right now, and I'm more interested in an elite group of people like yourself. Now, again, if I wanted a broader group of people, I would then move to that middle market because you don't want to lose the elite status. You don't want to lose the whale that you get every so often. You want to add to it that middle market. And then if you want to just be flooded because maybe you're selling advertising, maybe your client has a newsletter or a publication that sells advertising, you might go for that broader audience. And that's what you're going to tend to see in the mainstream media. Mainstream media has sensational topics. They have more excitement. They definitely have a regular schedule of programs so that they're building up behaviors and habits of their end users. If you're going to be regular at anything, it's going to be the print newsletter that you send out. My case, I'm not regular with anything because I got a lot of stuff going on. But the larger and bigger take home is, can you critically assess your current situation? Do you know specifically who you want to reach and why you want to reach them? Are you clear about your customer avatar and the people in that audience? What are their needs? What are their wants? I'm sure most of you don't want to be flooded with podcasts. You don't want to be flooded with blog posts to read. Most of the people I've interacted with who are Ad Briefing subscribers, they have specific questions and then they get back to work. But overall, folks, this is a way to create the outcome you're looking for. So the first question I was answering is, how do we get more of an audience for the podcast? I would argue you don't want more, you want higher quality. In order to have higher quality, it is focusing in on specific buyers. That might mean you don't get leads every day. That's okay. If you don't get leads every day, then where could you find a list that you could farm? Dream 100 Club is a good place to be. You can farm your house list. You can farm a rented list. And then ultimately, does that podcast serve your needs? Because it does take time to record. It takes time to fill out the meta descriptions. It takes time to write the show notes. And unless you have a service taking care of that for you, sometimes it may not be worth it. It may be something you can do retroactively. Now, I am not satisfied with my podcast, but I have so many materials that have been pre-recorded that it's an outlet that feels good for me as far as serving my audience. Because there are questions you guys come up with that are the same question I answered last year, and I could just point you to a podcast. So it's kind of has a high utility function. But the larger concept, though, is what works for you. What works for you? What are you trying to accomplish? Where do you want to be? Where are you today? Do you have materials you could recycle into a podcast? I've taken materials historically, handed them to a consultant or a contractor. The contractor divided it up into 10 or 15 minute segments, and then we just dripped it out on the internet. You could have had changes in platform, and now you've got to reestablish. Do you have all those audios together? So I want to leave you with the last part here. First off, if you have any questions, you can visit www.adbriefings.co.uk. I want to leave you with create your podcast to fit your purpose. Don't worry about how many visitors, how many listeners. If you have one whale of a customer listening to your podcast, that's fine. Now, there is social proof when you have a lot of subscribers to your podcast. There is the increased opportunity that someone could refer. But again, is it what are you taking time away from in order to get more traffic for your podcast or your webinar series or your landing pages? What are you taking away from? And if you can send traffic to a landing page and then to your audio or your video or your blog post, that's way better because you're going to narrow it down to actual leads and then you'll have a means of following up. So I hope this was useful to you. Again, if you have any questions, I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips, where we help you write copy that sells without the frustration and mistakes that a lot of people make. No sense writing a lot of copy if it's never going to be seen by a specific person who can buy from that copy. And ultimately, I've been answering questions about podcasting because I do have like 54 hours of podcasts. I think 114 episodes. I've been doing this kind of stuff for a while. And also I used to do what was kind of a micro podcast with private clients. Thanks for listening. Again, I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips. Visit us at www.adbriefings.co.uk. Thanks for listening.